Pastor Lamar, are you there?
I can hear you. It's still connecting. I'm on the Wi-Fi, but uh, just so people know, if you heard about the tornado that hit South Georgia, my house is one of those.
Right.
Uh, so my internet is kind of spotty. It
I,
just, yeah.
yeah, that's something we'll bear with. And, I actually just saw that before we connected. So I'm actually, thank you for doing this. I'm surprised that you agreed to this with everything going on. Um,
Oh, no problem. Yeah, just so people know that we just
yeah,
got power and internet, so it's not, up to par right now. So
yeah,
if that happens again, just know that's part of the reason why.
yeah. Well, thank you for doing this. I was blessed by your book, Disability and the
Thank you.
Church, InterVarsity Press, and I wanted to talk to you about it today. But I guess as you mentioned, you're in Georgia. Can
hmm
you just introduce yourself? Tell us all a little bit more about you.
Sure. Well, thanks first for having me. As I mentioned, I do live in Georgia, the Atlanta area. So yeah, for those who are watching, just pray for those. I live in a city called Noonan, which is about maybe 20 minutes south of Atlanta. And so that's the city that got hit by the F4 tornado. So yeah, just pray for that community as we're trying to start rebuilding. Thankfully, our house has cosmetic damage, but structurally, it's still okay to live in. It's just, like I said, the internet is spotty. But most
Yeah,
people um, online, even if you follow me on Instagram or Twitter, know me as the Autism Pastor. Um, People ask me why. It's actually not a name I came up with. It was because of the work that I did after I was diagnosed myself at age 36 on the autism spectrum. I started to have a lot of people in the autism community started to follow me, and because they didn't have a church, um, I sort of became the pastor for that community. And so that actually came from a woman who said that years ago. Um, and so I just changed all my handles to autism pastor because it made it easier for people to find me.
yeah,
So that term I didn't actually come up with. It was someone else who sort of named me that as sort of the official pastor to that community. So I was diagnosed myself at age 36, and we can talk more about that. I'm the lead pastor of a church in Atlanta called Tri-Cities Church. And I'm married to my wife of 20 years, and we have three beautiful boys. So that's me.
well, thank you so much. And yeah, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit more about your story, your diagnosis story, and I guess you could even
Mhm.
go into your book at that point too.
Yeah, so I like to share with people that, I wasn't diagnosed until I was 36, but I knew probably around the age of 7 or 8 that there were significant differences between me and the other kids. Like I did the way I describe it is it felt like the world was in on an inside joke that I didn't get. So there are a lot of
Mm,
things that I didn't understand. I used to pretend to understand things that I didn't understand. I would copy what other kids did just so I could fit in. But there were always social anxiety, communication challenges, even though I was verbal. Although um, my parents don't quite remember when I started talking.
mm,
Um, so there could or couldn't have been a speech delay. We don't know. But that part of my developmental history is a little bit hazy.
mm.
But I grew up in a time where, boys were considered to develop slower than girls, and a lot of other myths that kind of stop what would have been a diagnosis. And then also my family was a military family, so we moved every 3 years.
That's right.
And so a lot of probably what would have helped me to be diagnosed earlier was masked by the fact that we moved all the time. So no one
Mhm.
expected me to do well socially. So yeah, I always knew that. I ran into a lot of problems growing up, but somehow I seemed to kind of manage my way through them up until I hit a wall at age 36, and finally decided to try to find someone to help me to understand some of the things that I had been struggling with my whole life. And so eventually that led to clinical psychologist diagnosing me on the spectrum with Asperger's, which explained a lot of the issues that I had over the years. So, um, at the time, it was, it was helpful because it helped me to finally understand that I was human,
Mm.
that a lot of the ways I had been characterized as a kid as weird or weak or, aloof were just really a part of how God created me. And it was just, I just saw the world differently. So, yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned that it made you see yourself or feel human. And
Hmm.
that's honestly like a vibe that I got from reading your book. Even though you talk about these types of things, this isn't like a clinical book. There's a lot
No.
of emotion, a lot of what I believe is your personality in the book,
Hmm.
and it shows. And so I do
Hmm.
want to say thank you for sharing that story with us. Um, what what is the main point of your book? Like, if you had to say your book in one sentence, disability and the church, what is the main message you're trying to communicate?
Yeah. Great question. If I were to summarize it or give like an elevator pitch, it is to help the church to understand um, how vitally important it can be as a resource to the lives of persons impacted by disability. So
Yeah.
even though I struggled a lot growing up, I still love the church very much, and I still see it as one of the resources that helped me to get where I am. And so if that's true for me, I think it's true for others. The problem is that the church hasn't always done as well as it could at being support to people like
Mm.
myself, whether it's someone who has a physical, intellectual, or developmental disability. I still believe the church can help people to be their
Yeah.
fullest person in God. So yeah, I think the message is that the church, man, the disability community needs you, and we love you, and there's so much that you can offer to us, but also there's so much that the disability community can offer to the church.
That's such a good message, and it really it really impacted me. I think because of everything that was going on in the world recently,
Mm,
I kind of felt a lot of those things. We're gonna talk, or I want to talk to you more about the church specifically, but
mm-hmm,
I want to speak to our current moment right now, because in the book you actually draw parallels from your own experience to
mm-hmm,
the current social unrest in our nation.
mm.
Um, I'd like you to talk to this about this, and I want you to maybe share how the silent struggle for diversity and inclusion must be
Mm-hmm.
confronted.
Yeah,
I think you know what I'm speaking to. If you want to share that with everybody.
yeah. So one of the things that I talk about really early in the book is a question I had to ask myself. Because again, I sort of knew around 7 or 8, but again, my developmental history was sort of mysterious. There were things that, you learn coping mechanisms and strategies. I learned how to deny, deflect, defend myself against people making comments that were attacks against my character, which I later realized is not my character, it's just my neurology.
Mm.
Um, but when I got to the position where I actually sought a professional diagnosis wall, in my previous church, I was being considered to be the lead pastor, and I heard a lot of hurtful things being said about me, about my social interactions with people. But it was stuff I had
Mm.
heard my whole life. And so at that point, I had to realize everyone can't be wrong. So I asked myself a question: what do people experience when they experience me? Because it wasn't what I thought it was. So I could have a conversation with someone, but my body language, my facial expressions might be off-putting to them, and I had no clue that that was happening.
Yeah.
And so I use that question to draw a parallel to the church, that the church has to ask itself, what do people experience when they experience the church? Because it's not often what we think it is.
Mm.
And so the connection there is, as we're seeing all the stuff that's happened in our nation, and a lot of groups are beginning to form that are pushing for diversity and inclusion, saying that we've been left out of the conversation for years.
Mm.
I think we really need to pay attention because, as I had to tell myself, everybody can't be wrong. All these people can't be wrong about the
Mm.
state of race in our nation. All these
Mm,
people can't be wrong about violence against people of color. All these people
mm,
can't be wrong about some of the injustices that have been going on for centuries.
mm.
And so I had to ask myself that question and say, what do people experience when they experience me? And I'm inviting the church, and even our nation to ask that same question. What are people's experience with our churches and our nation who are people who are not in the majority? Because their experience is very different from what you think it is.
Yeah.
And all these people can't be wrong. They're not making
Mm.
these things up. And I think
Right,
that's
right.
sort of the message I was also trying to convey with the disability community when we're saying we're not always welcome at the church.
Mm.
Um, all these people are not can't be wrong. At some point, we have to ask ourselves, what are they really experiencing? And I think that's also true about injustice and a lot of things that we saw in 2020. We got to
Yeah.
ask ourselves that hard question.
Yeah, and I do thank you for being the one to bring that up. This
Mm-hmm.
is a really deeply personal book for you. I think you're sharing a lot
Mm-hmm.
of your story. So I wanted to ask you, was it hard to write this, knowing that it's going to be, published and people are going to read this? Was it difficult to share your story? And then also, how did you really come to all of these conclusions? Did it happen
Mm-hmm.
over time, in terms of like being able to put it into words and then
Mm-hmm.
getting into the book?
Yeah. So as far as telling a story, I think it became less difficult the further I walked, journeyed through unraveling my own history of not knowing I was on the spectrum and always being made to feel a certain way because I didn't meet a certain standard, especially when I expressed a call to ministry and I didn't fit the stereotypical characteristics of what someone would think a pastor should be like. Like I was the
Sure.
totally opposite of that, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so I didn't fit in a lot of churches and while people see and look at the success I've had, it's been a rough road. Like I bounced around a lot of
Mm,
places because it just was not welcome and not didn't fit in.
mm,
But I think after I got diagnosed, it finally gave me the language to explain myself to people and for me to start to become okay with who God created me to be. And the further I got in that journey, the easier it was to tell that story because I realized that there's so many other people like me who aren't blessed to be able to tell this story and have people to listen. And so it became easier because it became part of my calling. Um,
mm, mm,
so I've always sort of been an open book, and I don't mind telling people, my own struggles. I have like sort of this idea of what it's like to be a storyteller, and part of it is sharing your struggles and sharing your suspicions about things. I'm very suspicious about a lot of things, right? So that
mm.
part, it got easier. I think like putting it in words, one of the interesting things about being an author, this is my third book, but my first book published on a major platform, is by the time it gets into the hands of readers, it's probably something I wrote 2 years ago. So,
Mm,
um, so, it's, a lot of work has gone into it. As a matter of fact, there's a funny story I was sharing with the group the other day, a book club, that in the beginning of the book, I make a mention of my wife of almost 16 years.
mm,
Well, my wife and I have actually been married 20 years. That tells you how long ago I started writing this book,
mm. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that process, and as we were editing it, I just didn't think to go back and change that.
Yeah.
It had been, since 2017 when I started processing these ideas.
Yeah.
So it takes a while to put it all into words and to see the book come to life. And by the time you actually do the book deal, it may be 2 years before it gets in the hands of people. So that's
Yeah.
sort of the process of getting it into words. You have a lot of time to process and rewrite and to think. And I read that and I was like, oh, I didn't even change that. But that just tells you that I had been working on it for like 4 years. So,
Well,
so if you see that in the book, just know that that's not accurate at this time. It was accurate when I
well,
first started writing the book.
yeah. The finished project is so good. The finished product, I mean, is so
Hmm.
good. And there's a lot of memorable things about. One of them is the concept of a dinner table. This
Hmm.
this 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 concept really stood out to me. Use the concept of a dinner table to show how the church has failed to show honor to the disabled community. Can you explain and elaborate on this concept for us right now?
Yeah, so that actually comes from the parable in Luke 14, right? So if you read the story, Jesus is actually invited to a dinner party in which they also invite a man with a disability, in those days known as dropsy, which would have been probably the most modern version of that would be something like congestive heart failure, where it causes limbs to swell.
Mm.
And so Jesus knew that they didn't invite him there to actually include him. They invited him there to extort him, right? They wanted to see what Jesus was going to do. Is he going to heal on the Sabbath? And so I think Jesus realized that, there's a difference between being invited and being included. So he actually heals a man and dismisses him because they didn't really want him there anyway. He was just he was just a token for them. But then Jesus goes on to tell a story about, first he says, I notice all you guys sitting in the seats of honor. You probably shouldn't do that, because what if the host comes in and says that seat belongs to someone else, right? So that's sort of like the modern day equivalent of going to Thanksgiving and sitting at the adult table only for the adults to come in and tell you to sit at the children's table, right? It's like, so Jesus is like, that's going to be embarrassing for you, because you're assuming you're more honorable than someone else, and allow yourself to be invited to that space. But then he goes on to tell a story about a banquet at this dinner party, and in it he says that the guy sends out a servant, and the first group of people that they invite decline, and so he tells them to go out and invite the lame, the blind, the crippled, and the poor. And what Jesus does is he actually encourages, even as he's telling this to the people at the party, and then he tells them the story. He's encouraging to say, look, if you're going to throw a party, if you're going to build a banquet, and the banquet is sort of analogous to the kingdom, you start with this community first. You start with the poor, the blind, the lame, the crippled, the disability community, those who are disenfranchised, because that's how you build it. You build it that way first. And it's interesting that Jesus says, when you do that, God himself is responsible for the reimbursement. Because remember, he tells them, don't invite your brother and sister and people who can repay you. Instead invite this community that has been disenfranchised. And then God is going to be responsible. So it's almost like Jesus is saying there's a level of blessing that comes with honoring this community first, that you don't get when you try to take up all the seats of honor for yourself. And so what I'd say in the book is that I think one of the problems, especially in the West, is we built the church backwards. We've built it based on the people who can pay for our big buildings and our budgets, because we assume that the disability community has no value to add to our churches, and then we try to fit them in to what's left. And Jesus says, no, that's backwards. If you start with them, like, we think our churches are great, but imagine if we did it the way that Jesus said to do it, how much better they would be, right? If we built it the way that, so it's about giving that special honor to that community that he says, go after them first, and then God will take it. And then what's great about that story is when the servant goes out and brings in the community, there'll be room to do everything else you want to do in your church. But it's hard to fit them in when you don't start with them.
That's such a powerful story, and I really just love all of your insight on that. We can talk more about that, but I want to talk about a little aspect that you brought up, and that is that Jesus actually did heal the man, right? He did heal the man, even though Jesus knew, like, as you said, he was just their token guy, right? In your book, you actually do acknowledge that Jesus can heal if he wanted to today. If he wants to, he can. And so my question for you is, how can we glorify God rightly even when he chooses not to heal?
Yeah, great question. That's something that I have wrestled with over the years, right? So I approach it a couple of different ways. If you do a good study of Jesus' earthly ministry, you'll notice that most of his healing miracles were done at the beginning of his ministry, which suggests that a large reason why he did that was to establish his divinity, right? So that people knew that he was God. But we also know that he didn't heal everyone. So that meant that there had to be a larger reason for healing, because if he's going to heal, then he should have healed everyone. So the purpose was larger than just fixing people. It was establishing his divinity. But then also you see a trend where most of his healings were designed to help to restore a marginalized group of people back into the community. Because in those days, those who were sick and disabled were pushed off into the margins. And Jesus does the healing by way of showing people that they belong as much to the community of faith as anyone else. So when you look at those two things, you have to understand that there's a grander purpose. And I talk about that in the book.
Right.
One of the catechisms is that the chief end of man is to glorify God, right? I end up using an analogy of how to sort of handle this when you look at the story of the wheat and the weeds. And most people watching know, right? The wheat and the weeds grew up together. They look the same.
Yeah.
The servants come and say, "Hey, somebody's planted some weed in your wheat field. Should we tear it up? Separate it?" And the master says, "No, don't, because," and this is what's so great. He says, "Because if you tear up the weeds, you'll tear up the wheat." And I'm paraphrasing, I intend to still harvest the wheat. So I talk about in the book, and I've even written articles about this, is that like my brain, because I'm autistic, is a complicated system of wheat and weeds, right? They're all tangled up together. But what happens if we understand it from the perspective that God is so committed to getting the harvest that he dare not separate the wheat and the weeds because it'll damage the harvest. And so what I learned even about myself and what I learned about healing is that sometimes, even though God could separate the weed from the weeds, God has a bigger picture in mind and understands that if I do that, that might actually end up damaging the harvest that I can get out of that person's life. And so God is so committed to us and our ability to be fruitful in serving him that he's committed to see this thing through, because he still understands that despite your disability, there's a harvest that can come from your life.
Yeah.
And so what I tell people is, some of us may not be healed, but we're still his. And that's where my comfort comes from, is knowing that I might not be healed, but I'm still his, and there's still a harvest
That's so
that
good.
can come from my life.
Yeah.
And that's what helps me get out of bed in the morning when I'm struggling with sensory processing, when I struggle with social anxiety, whatever. God knows that there's a harvest that he can get out of my life living this way.
That is
and
such
I'm still
a good word.
his.
Yeah.
And it's hey, I will continue to believe and trust in that and know that he has a grander purpose for that.
Absolutely, man. That is so good. I love that line too. He can heal, but even if he doesn't, we're still his. I want to talk a little bit more about. I guess we're getting a little bit personal here. I guess I feel that you're being open to me, and I appreciate that. Doctor, I think Doctor, right? Dr. Derwin L. Gray, he endorsed your book, and these are his words. He said, "Dr. Lamar Hardwick inhabits the story he is writing. He writes from a unique vantage point. He has Asperger's syndrome and autism spectrum disorder. His autism doesn't define him. Jesus does." Okay, those were his words. And I want to ask you, first off, is that true? And then second, how can I live my life, with everything that I have, or anybody? How can anybody live their life with everything they have and not be defined by those things, but truly be defined by Jesus?
Yeah, great question. I appreciate Dr. Gray. He and I sort of struck up an online friendship a couple years ago when he read an article I wrote for Christianity Today. I think it was like 2017, and he actually contacted me and said, he's blessed by the article. So we've been just sort of friends since then, at least in an online sense. We've never actually got a chance to meet in person, although I've been to his church.
Oh, nice.
But he's a great guy. I was super blessed that he did that. So that I can answer the question, I do think it's true. I would say the way that I've discovered that to be true is when I learned to lean into what Paul writes about his own thorn when he says, he says, I was given this thorn. And a lot of people speculate about what it is. I tend to believe, and I talk about in the book, that Paul did have some disabling and limiting things that he was dealing with. He seems to suggest that it is physical.
Right.
But here's what I learned. That text came alive for me after I was diagnosed. And when I read it my whole life, and it just became more alive. He says a couple things that have helped me to be defined by Jesus. So I'll start from the bottom and I'll work my way up. The first thing that struck me was he said, when he talks about his thorn, he says, I begged God 3 times, and God says, I'm not going to take it away. And we know that his grace is sufficient. But then he says something interesting. He says, so now I boast about my weaknesses. And that's not really the part that I like, right? Because nobody wants to talk about how limited, right? Nobody wants to talk about how limited they are. But the B clause is what got me. He says, I boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can be seen in me.
Right? That's right. Right.
And so there's actually this way of understanding how to live and be defined by Jesus by actually leaning into the things that limit you. So the best way I could say is, I've said this before, I openly share what I'm up against so that people can see what God is up to. If people didn't know that I was on the spectrum and I had social anxiety and I had all these things that I had to deal with, then they couldn't fully appreciate how Christ is working in me, because they would think it was me.
That's right. That's right.
So when you see me on the stage preaching, when you see me writing books, when you do, you know that there has to be some other power at work, because I'm telling you that I struggle. Like I don't have it all together. I have a lot of issues. I really struggle with a lot of things. But what that does, what Paul says, which is, I'm going to tell you about all my weaknesses and my limitations so that the power of Christ can be seen. And that ends up becoming what defines me more than anything else. So I don't deny my disability. I own it. This is just like God told Moses, I'm the one who made your mouth. I know all about the stuff that you're limited. But he still called Moses.
That's right.
The other part of that I say has helped me to learn how to be defined by Jesus is, if you back up, Paul says, I was given this thorn to keep me from becoming conceited.
Right.
What I love about that is that Paul sort of gives a nod to the fact that his thorn or his disability was not what was going to keep him from becoming the best version of himself. In actuality, this thorn kept him from becoming the worst version of himself, right? The worst version of yourself is a conceited self.
Is a conceited one, right?
Is a version of you that thinks that you don't need God. Right?
Yeah.
And he says the thorn actually keeps him from becoming the worst version of himself, which is someone who doesn't need God. So if that's true, then that means that my disability can't stop me from becoming the best version of myself. It actually stops me from becoming, if I lean into Jesus, it actually stops me from becoming the worst version of myself. So I lean into that because I'm totally dependent on God. Like I tell people, like, you have no idea. Like, I'm deathly afraid every time I get up to speak or do. Christ is forming me and shaping me and using me, right? But if you don't know that, you'll think I'm just a great speaker. I'm not. I'm really not. There's a lot of prayer and practice and rehearsal and a lot of things that, but I think I've learned how to. And why we don't do that well in the church is because we have this aversion to suffering and pain. Like, we try to avoid it as much as we can. We try to avoid acknowledging it. We try to avoid being engaged in it. And I think it's the opposite. The more I tell you what I'm up against, the more you can see what God is up to in my life. And that helps me be defined by Jesus.
Yeah. Honestly, like, if people say those type of things, I sometimes I can see how people would just be like, oh, you're just being like a humble guy. But I feel that, no, you're really, you mean this. And I think that's the the right attitude to have, is that you're not trying to have some sort of false humility or some sort of boasting in your own,
Mm.
skills or anything. I think that really is the attitude of Paul, where he's trying to boast in Christ only. And I think that's some great insight you have there. Um, I want to
Mm.
talk about something that you said about how our churches can better serve those with disabilities, and you said that
Mm-hmm.
we can build a learning culture in our churches. I
Mm-hmm.
want to talk about that phrase, a learning culture. What do you mean by that? Do you mean you want Sunday school classes about this type of stuff? Do you mean like getting speakers for these type of things? What do you mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's all of the above. I think it's creating an environment where we're talking about disability, learning from persons with disability. It becomes a natural, organic part of the church, right? I think it's still a very
Mm-hmm.
taboo subject. It comes up maybe once a year, maybe if it's like Disability Month or Autism Awareness
Yeah,
Month,
yeah,
right?
right,
But
right.
but to like to create a true culture where learning can take place. And so when I talk about that in the book, I'm using the analogy of the parable of the sower, where Jesus says a guy scatters the seed. And if you notice, there's three different responses. The first one, he says that the seed hits the ground, and eventually, when Jesus interprets, he says that a bird eats it,
Mm-hmm.
because, and he says that it's because they don't understand, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I've told my church is, okay, so I know this is not a mathematical equation, so I'm not trying to say that, but there's four
Yeah.
responses, so it's four quadrants, right?
Okay,
What
right,
if
right.
25% of our problem in churches is that people simply don't understand things,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because Jesus even says that that group would come to faith, but they just don't understand. It's lack of understanding. I think
Mm-hmm.
the church would do better. Maybe 25% of the problem is the church would do better in this area, but there's just such a lack of understanding that
Mm-hmm.
the seed keeps getting gobbled up and we're not making
Mm-hmm.
any progress. So building a learning culture is saying at least let's pay attention to creating an environment and creating opportunities in our church where that's a part of the organic process of the church, where whether
Mm-hmm.
it's and that means for whatever your vehicle for creating learning opportunities in your church, leverage that to teach people about disabilities. If it's Sunday school, if it's small groups, if it's, I talk a lot about preaching and teaching about is important.
Right.
If it's providing curriculum, bringing in outside speakers. I know in my past church, we would do lunch and learns.
All right.
Whatever you have to do, whatever the vehicle is that you already leverage for in your church, because, the root word of disciple is to learn, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we just need to add whatever mechanism in our church for discipling people. We need to add in there opportunities to learn about disability and make it consistent.
Yeah.
And then that way we create a culture where we're constantly learning about and learning from people with disabilities that will help our churches get better.
Yeah. Speaking of different ministries at church, at your church, at Tri-Cities Church, I saw that
Mm-hmm.
you're beginning a special needs ministry. It looks
Mm-hmm.
like you guys are starting this. Can you explain this for us and maybe inspire some of us who are thinking about these type of things?
Yeah. So, we say special needs ministry, disability ministry. I use that interchangeably because I know some people have different preferred terminology.
Right.
So really, like, if I were to zoom out, my goal, my desire, and part of the reason why the subtitle of the book is a vision for diversity and inclusion is to make the church as it exists accessible to all people with varying disabilities, right? So,
Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so when we say starting a special needs ministry, what we're saying is that eventually we want to create a church where everyone, regardless of their ability or disability, has access to the mission, vision, values, programming of the church, so that we're not doing things that unintentionally exclude people. So if you have small groups,
Mm-hmm.
are we unintentionally doing it in a way that doesn't include people with disabilities? Are we, so a great
Mm-hmm.
example, this is a small example. I consulted with a church a while back
Yeah.
who would do communion at night. And it was
Okay.
just a tradition.
Okay. Okay.
And what I told them is that if you're going to be more inclusive of persons with disabilities, you might have to change that because you have a whole contingency of older people
Mm-hmm.
who don't see well, who don't drive at night.
Right. 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 Okay.
Yeah,
Oh, good. I think we're back.
I warned you this
Yeah,
internet is
yeah,
spotty.
it was fine. Um, yeah, you were talking about communion and how having it at night would be a disadvantage to people with disabilities or the older population.
Right, yeah. And so that's just, I mean, it's a very simple fix, right? But I think
Hmm.
a lot of churches don't think about certain things that may unintentionally create barriers, right? So
Yeah.
what I was consulting with the church is saying, I know that's been a tradition and this has been the way you've done it for years,
Yeah.
but you have to think about, your congregation is aging, the community is aging. There are people who can't drive at night, they're not able to do that. And you're effectively limiting their ability to come together at the Lord's table with you because of a
Mm-hmm.
simple time fix, right? And there's
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
things that I've consulted with churches just to say, so special needs ministry, like what we're doing at Tri-Cities Church, is we're starting by evaluating, are there areas of our church, as we already do things, that are inaccessible to people with disabilities, whether it's physical, intellectual, or developmental, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So one of the things we first did, and I always say this at church, is that we got to put our heart follows treasure, right? So Jesus
Mm-hmm.
teaches that. So we want our
Mm-hmm.
heart to be in it. We got to put some funds to it. So we did a huge campaign and raised lots of money to get it started. And so part of the process now is like we're starting to include things to help people to be more engaged in the worship service. So we've got like sensory bags. We're creating a sensory room
Oh,
for
wow.
people who may need to step out, or if a parent has a child. So we're not trying to segregate them by saying you have to use this room,
Right.
but
Right.
we're
Right.
creating environments all around our church that are conducive to people of different abilities, right? So
Yeah.
if you come in and the music is a little bit too loud, although we keep it at a certain level because I can't handle it with my sensory issues.
Right.
We
Right. Right.
have noise canceling headphones. We have bags that families can pick up
Mm.
that have fidget toys and sensory things for
Oh.
children who may be on the spectrum, noise
Oh.
canceling headphones, sensory rooms, a parent room.
Yeah.
But then we're also evaluating, curriculum that can go alongside with what we're teaching our kids and adults and teenagers. Is there an accessible form of that? We're retweaking curriculum so that it's accessible. If someone has an intellectual disability, we can be able to share the gospel at a level that works for them.
Yeah.
So really, it's just a complete overhaul. And then what I've found, like we're doing in our church, and COVID has slowed down a little bit of this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, but what I found is that it's just conducive to go around to every ministry area in your church and say,
Mm-hmm.
as we do things right now, if someone who was blind or have a hearing impairment or has autism or has ADHD, would they be able to participate in this? And if not, how do we fix it so that they can participate in everything that we're already doing? So we're not asking
Right.
churches to do more. We're saying make it accessible, right?
Right. Right. Right.
Don't
Right.
don't do things that everyone can't participate in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's what we're doing now.
I think you kind of hit on a question that I was going to ask, and that was like, how can churches adapt to this vision that you have post pandemic? It sounds like we should be thinking through how we can adjust things, not necessarily changing everything like what you said, but thinking how can we accommodate everybody in this
Right.
post pandemic? Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Um,
unfortunately, what we found is, and I mentioned it a little bit, and I was saying to someone the other day, like I touched on COVID a little bit because as I was writing the book and I was up against the deadline, we were just in the beginning stages of that. So
yeah, I
so much,
sense that. Yeah.
yeah, so much has happened since then. When I wrote
Right.
those words about it, like I had no clue how devastating this was going to be. But what I also
Yeah. Mm.
saw is, and this will probably come up in my next project, what I also saw is that the church actually, and I hate to say this, but this is the truth because I love the church,
Mm.
so I'm going to tell the truth.
Mm. Mm.
When
Mm.
accessibility became an everybody issue, the church got very creative on how it
Mm.
provided accessibility. So when everybody was
Mm-hmm.
not able to
Mm-hmm.
access the buildings because of lockdown and all that, I noticed that the
Mm-hmm.
church universal became very creative. It found money to do online things and online curriculum, and it became very creative with its
Yeah.
programming because now no one
And
could
it just
access the
found the
building,
money, right?
right? It
Right.
just found
Right.
it, right?
Right.
But what I
Mm-hmm.
found is that was a pretty bad witness though on the church because there have been people,
Mm-hmm.
and I say this, I don't know if it's in the book, but I tweeted this, the distance that COVID created between pastors and parishioners is analogous to the distance that always existed between the church and the disability community.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
That distance has always been there.
Yeah.
What we found is when accessibility became an everybody issue, the church found a way to give people access to what it was doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think what we need to do is ride that wave and that energy out of COVID and not forget about the people who were not having access to what we were doing because we weren't providing it for them.
Yeah.
So what we showed the disability community is that it can be done. We just weren't doing it. And so now I
Right.
think we're going to have to be accountable for that.
Yeah. And I think that's why your book is so, I want to say relevant. I mean, it's always relevant, right? This issue is always relevant, but coming into this post-pandemic time, this can really help a lot of churches. I want to just say open their eyes to see where they were blind before, where we've been blind before, and how we can move forward with this. I have a couple more questions, and then I want to respect your time. But the first one is, how does your book resonate with Easter coming up when we're thinking about the death and resurrection of Jesus? How does your book resonate, especially during this time of Easter? And then how is it like working with IVP, with InterVarsity Press, getting your first major book out there?
Yeah, so the Easter thing is a great and interesting question. I dive into it a little bit in the book. We're talking about the crucifixion, what Jesus' crucifixion would have really been like a true Roman crucifixion. A lot of the depictions that we have are not actually how the Romans did it.
Yeah.
But I also dive into, let's think about for a second, when he comes back, he still has the disabling marks from the torture and the abuse that he took. So if those things weren't healed, what does that say about our relationship to disabilities and even Jesus' relationship? You know, you got to understand the 9-inch spikes that went through his wrists would have torn up at least 7 tendons. The way that Romans would have crucified him, the spike would have went somewhere right around his Achilles tendon. And I talk about that in my book. I've torn my Achilles tendon. It is not an easy injury to get over, right?
Oh, yeah. We know
And so if that happened to Jesus and it wasn't healed, he came back with the nails in his wrists and his side. Like, what does that say about his body? But really the imagery of the body of Christ and its relationship to disability, right? And I even talk a little bit about in Revelation. So I want people to go and read that. And that's work that actually have carried on from other great theologians like Nancy Easton, who wrote The Disabled God. I quote her, right? But we have to start thinking about that realistically. And what does that say about our relationship to our bodies and our relationship to the body of Christ and how it relates to disability? Jesus took these disabling marks and came back with them, and they were identifying marks. That's how Thomas was able to identify that it was really him.
Right.
So theologically, I'm not going to give an answer. I just want people to wrestle with that. Those are important things to think about in our faith and in our relationship to disability, right? So I think Easter is a great time to reflect on that Jesus willingly allowed himself to be disabled. And that's one of the many ways that he identifies with a marginalized community as well, those who have suffered, is that he allowed himself to be disabled and kept those marks of disablement as a way of identifying with us. That's a great message.
It is.
Easter.
Yeah.
So think about that. And, as we're going through Holy Week, I think about the lengths by which God was willing to identify with this community. And if he goes far out to that extent to identify with the disability community, that means everybody in between there, he also identifies with in a very real way, right? So he covers it all. I think that's a great thing to think about. But working with IVP, man, it's been great. Like, I think IVP is really on the cutting edge of all things diversity and inclusion, right? They really promote authors of color, women authors. So they have been a dream to work with. As quiet as it's kept, I had already started working on my second book. I'm hoping I can do it with them. Well, actually, my fourth book, but my next book, rather, I should say.
Right.
I'm hoping I could do it with them because they've just been great. Like, it's been great working with them
I
and
love to hear
supporting
it.
the vision. and honestly, there's not a lot of people of color speaking in the spaces that I'm speaking in.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's been great to have a publisher that honors that and understands that there's a lane there, that there's not a lot of voices of color speaking about disability and the
Yeah.
church and theology, and really doing a lot to help promote the book and to make sure that we can get it in people's hands so that they could, at least have a conversation with themselves and with the church about this important issue. So they've
Yeah.
been great.
Yeah. And I hope it moves from a conversation to action. Yeah. Thank you
Yeah.
so much, Pastor Lamar, for doing this and for just talking about your book with me, giving me a
Mhm.
little bit more of your story and a little bit more insight. And also just pointing my heart towards Jesus a little bit more during this Easter season with your message and with your stories and with your book. Thank you so much. I
Wow.
needed this, and so it was good.
Wow. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it, man.
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Lamar. We'll hopefully talk again soon. Have a great
Sure.
Easter, and yeah, I'm gonna keep praying for you. I know you've been through a lot recently, so I
Yeah.
yeah, I'm glad God has kept you here, and yeah, I've been blessed to talk with you. Thank you so much.
But thank you, man. Have a great Easter.
Yeah, I'll see you around.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.